Welcome to the WTR Small Cap Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Tim Gerdeman, Vice Chair and Co-founder and Chief Marketing Officer of Water Tower Research. In today's podcast episode, I'm being joined by Dr. Mitch Steiner, President and CEO of Veru, NASDAQ ticker symbol VERU. Veru is a clinical stage biopharmaceutical company focused on developing novel medicines for the treatment of cardiometabolic and inflammatory diseases. Also joining us is my colleague, Do Kim, Senior Research Analyst and creator of WTR Biotech Spotlight podcast series at Water Tower Research. Good morning, gentlemen, and thank you for joining today's podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Tim. Thanks.
Mitch, could you please provide a brief overview of the company and your clinical pipeline to kick things off this morning?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Veru is a company focused on cardiometabolic disease. We have two programs. One is on obesity, which we'll be chatting about today, in which we're using a drug called Enobosarm in phase 2B that we just have results. So I'm excited to be able to report some of that today. And then our second program is sabizabulin, which we recently announced. We're moving into cardiometabolic disease related to inflammation associated with atherosclerosis. The biggest problem with heart disease is not just lipids, but also the inflammation that causes the lipids to be a problem. And we have an oral agent that's going to be entering phase 2 that can be given in combination with lipids to decrease inflammation.
Great. And then just a quick follow-up question, then I'll turn it over to Do Kim, but this is certainly an incredibly hot topic in the media almost daily of late. GLP-1 drugs are now commonly known for obesity and weight loss, but lean mass preservation is growing in importance for the next generation of drug development in obesity. Can you discuss the need for preserving muscle in the patients of GLP-1s, please?
Yeah, the GLPs took us by storm. And they took us by storm because you're losing so much weight. And the problem that happened about a year and a half ago is it became clear that there's an exchange rate. For every pound of fat that you lose a pound of muscle. And so that has created controversy. The controversy is being considered, is it adaptive or maladaptive? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And very, very clearly, it's probably not a good thing. And particularly, everybody agrees that it's not a good thing for older patients who may have loss of muscle. Interestingly, the FDA started to weigh in. They put out a guidance about a month ago. And in the guidance, it's very clear that they wanted to reset the definition for obesity. So obesity now is defined as excess adiposity, excess fat. The definition of a weight reduction drug is a drug that gets rid of adiposity. I'm going to say that again, a drug that gets rid of adiposity. The FDA wants you to look with DEXA scans to make sure you're not losing muscle. Well, this craze of losing, 10%, 15%, 25%, 30%, and half of its muscle or a third of its muscle is clearly not. It's clearly on the radar for FDA, and the patient population that's most at risk are the older patients, over the age of 60, because they've already lost muscle. And so this will be sort of the focus of our discussion today. Why did we pick that patient population? We picked it because there's no controversy there. You got to be careful with the pharmacologic intervention, because if you lose too much muscle, you can put them into trouble.
I will say extemporaneously, anyone who's a fan of Dr. Peter Attia, the longevity expert, which I certainly am, knows the critical importance of lean muscle mass and not losing it. So on that note, I'll turn it over to Do Kim.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, Mitch. Do Kim here. Thanks for being on the podcast. What you said about muscle loss with GLP-1s, definitely an issue and something the investor community is growing more aware of. It's not, I think, as commonly known to the public or the patients that are on GLP-1s. What was interesting is I read a Stat News article yesterday. Lilly's triagonist, retatrutide, it's leading to too much weight loss in patients, and it's leaving them weak. They're seeing a loss of muscle strength. So it's coming to a point where these GLP-1s and these combination of drugs are potentially doing more harm as you increase the weight loss, right? And now as we look at your drug, could you talk about the drug mechanism that preserves the muscle and the development history that led you to this development?
I'd be happy to. So what got us for a call to action, which is kind of what you're saying is, losing weight is a good thing. Losing adiposity is what the goal should be. Losing muscle is not a good thing. And even the concept of healthy dieting, you lose 25% of your weight in muscle, that should be okay because that's fine for healthy dieting. You can't use a percentage. You have to use an absolute amount. So if you keep losing 25% for 4 years, and you're not going to have any muscle left. So that's a problem. So our drug, Enobosarm, has been in development for many years. Like the myostatin inhibitors, it's been used in multiple indications, in multiple conditions. It just has not been approved yet. And we have the same situation. We started out in frailty in my former company, GTX. And from frailty, we went into cancer wasting. And so why would you do that? Well, we started with frailty and we showed that this is a drug that binds to the androgen receptor. We know what happens with the androgen receptor. You build muscle. The problem with the androgen receptor is that women, have an androgen receptor too. But if you give a testosterone, for example, you masculinize women. If you give testosterone, it gets converted to estrogen. You're worried about blood clots, da, da, da. So the company GTX developed this compound. And the compound's concept was to make it's called a hormone mimetic, something that mimics a hormone, but without the side effects of a hormone. So it's not steroidal. So it's not a substrate for aromatase. It can't be made into estrogen. It's not a substrate for DHT. DHT is what makes you lose your hair. DHT is what grows prostate. DHT is what masculinizes women. It doesn't have that ability. So that's why we went into frailty first. Problem about 15 years ago, frailty. Nobody knows the endpoints, but we learned so much about frailty, losing muscle with age, losing physical strength, falling, breaking your hip, that kind of stuff. So then we went into cancer wasting. Why would you do that? Well, guess what? First time somebody knows they have a cancer is they stop eating. They've lost their appetite. And when you lose your appetite, you lose your fat, you lose your muscle. And so it's a good surrogate disease because you're basically asking the question, if you give an Enobosarm, can you treat that situation? And we did. We were able to show that we maintain muscle, decrease fat in some cases, and increase function. And so a year ago, when the call to action came, that patients were losing, 40% of their lean mass at a year, with the exchange rate of a pound for a pound, we said, you know what if we moved the Enobosarm into this space? And that's what we did. And so when you think about it, we said, can we reverse this? Can we take a GLP-1? This is an important point. That's non-selective. So let's think about that. It's telling the brain not to eat, creates a hypocaloric state, a starvation state, and muscle and fat just start wasting away non-selectively. That's why you end up with 40-60, 40 muscle loss, 60% fat loss. What if you had a drug that in combination with GLP-1 says, you know what, don't touch muscle. Just burn the fat, preserve the muscle. And so that you make the GLP-1 in this starvation state much more selective. And that's the next generation of drug. It's not about how much weight you lose. If you can lose the same amount as semaglutide or tirzepatide, any of these drugs, just like you said in your opening comments, you had your triple threat that Lilly's developing. And then at the end, you said, oh, you lost 30%, whatever the number is. But it's all fat. That's pretty cool. And you're going to see from the data from our study, that's exactly what this agent did in combination with GLP-1. It caused the composition of the weight that you lost to be almost all fat. That's pretty cool. And you hold on to lean. So what you want to ask from your next generation of drugs is not can we hack off an arm, a leg, and lose a tremendous amount of weight. The question is going to be, can you get that same kind of weight loss, same degree of weight loss, but make it all fat, just like the FDA said. Obesity is excess adiposity. Treatment is get rid of the adiposity, not get rid of muscle adiposity.
Right. And it looked like in your phase 2b trial, the data that you presented, you accomplished just that. Could you just review some of the data highlights that show that preserving lean mass and burning more fat?
Yeah. There's a whole story here, which is really, really cool. And so first of all, let me be very clear. This is top-line results. And the reason it's top-line results is because this trial is still ongoing. The trial has two parts. So before I tell you the results, maybe it's important to understand what we were trying to do, what the design was. The design was taking patients over the age of 60. Remember, there's no controversy there. They're the patients most at risk. They're obese or overweight, and they're starting at GLP-1 for the first time. Starting at GLP-1 for the first time. And the one we picked was semaglutide, which is Wegovy. The reason we picked that is because there's a lot of data out there that tells you exactly how much the muscle they lose or lean mass they lose, how much fat they lose over time. So we can actually make a study. And on the Lilly, it's not as clear. They give you percentages, they don't give you absolute numbers, so it was not as clear. But semaglutide was clear. Then we said, okay, let's take these older patients and divide them into three groups. One group is what happens with GLP-1 by itself. And we picked 16 weeks as our endpoint because interestingly, when you start at GLP-1, that first 16 weeks, you lose half the weight you're going to lose over that year. So it's a nice window to look for a free fall and see if you can, in that free fall, because muscle will match that. Can you preserve muscle, get to the same weight loss? And so GLP-1 by itself, GLP-1 with Enobosarm 3 milligrams. To pause for a moment, the reason we picked 3 milligrams, by the way, Enobosarm is an oral agent, take it once a day. The reason we picked 3 milligrams is because all of our data, we had 5 muscle studies with 1,000 patients that shows that 3 milligram maintains or builds muscle, improves physical function, decreases fat. And so we said, okay, that's a known. So we know what happens with 3. Then we went to 6 milligrams in combination with a GLP-1. Why did we pick 6? Well, it turns out 3 and 6, it plateaus. And when you look at other patient populations, in drugs, sometimes it doesn't just go dose dependent straight up. You can get a plateau. We know with that tissue, you get a plateau. Interestingly, with fat, we don't see a plateau. So you can see in other patient population. So when you give the higher doses, you get more fat loss. Aha. So in this study, we said, let's pick the 6, because maybe the 6 will have more fat loss than the 3. Because remember, the definition of a weight loss drug is loss of adiposity. So that was the thought. The thought also was to look at physical function. Now, to pause for a moment, the reason physical function is important is because the FDA has taken the position that body composition by itself is not enough. Just to show you maintain muscle, what does that mean? If you hold on to lean mass, what does that mean? How does a patient feel, function, and survive? Well, a good thing you can measure is physical function. But it's very important that you measure the right kind of physical function. Let me give you an example. You'll really appreciate this. It turns out that the muscle, we have 2 types of muscle fibers. You have one that's explosive, like you can get out of a chair, go upstairs, get out of a tub, carry groceries. You have endurance. 6-minute walk test, how far you can walk. As you age, the endurance ones are fine. As you age, you lose those explosive fibers. You lose the ability to get out of a chair, balance yourself, you fall, break your hip, going upstairs, that kind of stuff. So as you age, that's the muscle fiber you want to go after. So if you want to go after that muscle fiber, then the physical function test that you pick has to be one that measures that. If you do a 6-minute walk test and you lose weight and your cardiovascular is better, you may actually walk further, but you can't get out of a chair, you can't get out of a tub, you can't go upstairs, you fall, you break your hip. In fact, the Wegovy label had to be updated after the SELECT trial was done because they showed a 4-fold increase in hip fractures and pelvic fractures. Well, the hip fractures and pelvic fractures, the patients lost weight and they're getting around better. I'm not denying that, but they fell. They fell. The balance, something's not right. So that's an important element of the trial design. And then the second part of the study is after we get to 16 weeks is we stop the GLP-1. The other big problem with GLP-1 containing drugs, and this is really frustrating patients, is when they stop at GLP-1, something interesting happens. Because the muscle's been depleted, they have this rebound weight gain. And the rebound weight gain is all fat. So imagine a situation of an older patient. They say, I feel weak. I get off the GLP-1. Now I get my weight back that I had before, but my muscle is less than where I started. And you keep doing that, and you end up with just enriching for fat and losing more and more muscle. So if Enobosarm can take care of the muscle reserve, so it doesn't get depleted, and you stop the GLP-1, the working hypothesis is that that will blunt the fat regain and the weight regain that happens after you stop a GLP-1. That's a completely separate program. And the data I'm going to share with you now is going to be the first part, what happens with GLP-1 in combination with a muscle-preserving drug. The second part, that data will be available second quarter. And because of that, it's still blinded. This is the safety data we'll discuss in aggregate, and I'll give you some clues about that. But the data for the first part is top line and exciting. So this is what we learned. So the primary endpoint for the study was lean mass. And the first part was lean mass for both the Enobosarm arms, the 3 and the 6, compared to placebo. And we showed a 71% preservation, if you want to call it that, of the lean mass, 71% preservation. And the 3 milligram dose, interestingly, there was no lean loss at 16 weeks, compared to almost 4% lean loss for the semaglutide alone. The 6 milligram dose didn't do better than the 3, but we didn't expect that, as I told you, plateaus in other populations. But the 3 did great. P-value for the all group was it was 0.002, and the p-value for the 3 milligram was p-values less than 0.001. Real, unambiguous. We hold on to lean mass. Well, you just told me 6 milligram might have more fat mass loss. It did. So the fat mass, it was a dose dependent from 0 to 3 to 6, just as expected. And there's a 46% reduction in fat compared to semaglutide alone. And that p-value is 0.014. So what does that mean? That means that if you had the placebo group, the semaglutide alone in 16 weeks had about an 8.36% loss of fat. It was about 12.2% loss of fat for the 6 milligram. That's 4% for a big compartment. 4% is a lot of fat. So what does that mean for weight? Remember, we said you just held on to lean. So one of the conceptually people think about, if you hold on to muscle and you get to 16 weeks, that's a good thing, but you may end up weighing heavier because you got to make up for that loss with fat. Did that happen? It did happen. So the weight loss was essentially the same for the semaglutide alone, the 3 milligram Enobosarm semaglutide, and 6 milligrams semaglutide. So if the weight is the same, that can only happen if you lose more fat. And that means what happened to the amount of tissue that you lost? What was the composition of your total weight loss? So I told you when we started the discussion today that the composition of the weight loss at a year for semaglutide was 40% lean, 60% fat. What did we see in our study? If for the semaglutide alone, it was 32% lean and 68% fat. So it's pretty close to what you would see at a year. What happened for the all group? The all group was 9.4% lean and 90.6% fat. Well, that's pretty good. How about for the 3? The 3 milligram, 99.1% fat and 0.9% lean. So it fell exactly as you would expect, meaning that the only way that you can hold on to lean and get to the same weight is you have to lose more fat, and we lost more fat. So think about that for a moment. That means that we just took a non-selective GLP agent and made it selective. We told the body in a starvation state, leave muscle alone, double up on the fat. And so if you want to have a new generation of drugs to get rid of adiposity, get rid of fat, well, if you're carving out and burning out 99% fat and having 1% lean, that's a good step in the right direction. And you can imagine in a year's time what potentially can happen. But here's the issue. Okay, you showed you preserve. Remember, I told the FDA really doesn't care. You preserve lean unless you can show how a patient feels, functions, and survives. All right, we went to function. We went right into the lion's den. But remember, it only matters if the patient population has a problem. So in other words, if function gets better with a GLP-1, or we make better, or they get worse. So here's the important data, first data of its kind. What we showed is that patients on GLP-1 alone at 16 weeks have a problem. And the way we determine that, we use a stair climb test. Stair climb test measures those type 2 fibers, explosive fibers, as I mentioned, and we had to pre-specify what's the cutoff, okay? So in other words, what's the decline that you consider significant? Well, it turns out that as you age, you lose about 1.38% of stair climb power a year. So we picked 10%. 10% is about 8 to 10 years of stair climb power being lost in 16 weeks. So we really picked a hard number. So if you lose that and pause for a moment, what that means is that that stair climb test has a whole body of literature in older patients that show that if you do poorly on stair climb, you're the patients that are going to have trouble with mobility disability, functional limitations, gait issues, balance issues, falls, fractures, hospitalizations, mortality. All that can be dipped into. So it's not just they didn't do well in stair climb, but that has predictive value. What do we find? 42.6% of the semaglutide patients alone had a greater than 10% decline in stair climb power at 16 weeks. So that's 8 to 10 years worth of aging, okay? And we were able to, at every dose, whether it's all of the whole Enobosarm group of 100 patients, or the 6 milligram group or the 3 milligram group, we showed about a 50% reduction in the number of patients that have a problem getting that show the greater than 10%. So we're able to reduce that number by 50% plus. For example, the 3 milligram group was 62%, and that p-value is 0.0066. And for the whole group, it was 54%, and that p-value was 0.0049. Real numbers, highly statistically significant. So what that means is the story is a beautiful story. It's telling you that lean mass matters, because in the placebo group, 32% of patients, in the placebo group, 32% of the weight they lost was lean, and 42.6% of those patients ended up having a physical function problem with stair climb. And we were able to show with Enobosarm that we were able to hold on to lean, make up for it by fat loss, having the tissue that you lost almost all fat, 90 to 90% fat, holding on to lean, and we preserve physical function. So to me, this study hit exactly what we needed to hit. It showed you have a problem in older patients, and that Enobosarm clearly, unambiguously maintains lean mass, and that you've done what the FDA wants you for weight reduction drug, that is to focus on adiposity loss.
Yeah, it sounds like you accomplished what you needed to get accomplished in this phase 2B. I guess
Absolutely.
what investors are also looking at are the other approaches that are targeting lean mass preservation, and comparing Enobosarm to them. Or we're talking about Lilly just acquired a smaller biotech that has a activin receptor type 2 ligand trap, and you have Scholar Rock out there with myostatin inhibitor. How do you think your molecule stacks up to these other approaches?
Great question. So, the Versanis drug was a drug that Novartis had originally, and they tested in all kinds of patient populations, kind of like what we did, because they were never approved and still have never been approved. And the problem is that frailty, for example, takes a long time, and some of these other indications take a long time. This has been I call it a Goldilocks indication, because when you lose with semaglutide, you lose 8 to 10 years worth of muscle and 8 to 10 years worth of stair climb power in 16 weeks. That's accelerated frailty. That's and you've got a problem. Myostatin inhibitors, right off the bat, what makes us different is we're oral, and they're all either IV or sub-Q. So from a commercial standpoint, that's the first, in my opinion, first hurdle. Second, myostatin inhibitors make muscle, but the quality of muscle is a big question mark. The elephant in the room is they've had a hard time showing physical function. And we've shown physical function because we work through the androgen receptor, which is the testosterone receptor. People know testosterone improves physical function, particularly type 2 fibers, which is the explosive kind to get you up the stairs and out of a chair. So if they don't show function, that's a problem. And to pause for a moment, there's been a misconception in the field, at least based on how we read the guidance and how our interactions with the FDA. And the FDA is having a tough time with the endpoint of what happens when you have a compound that, like a semaglutide, that loses weight, and you add a second compound that loses weight, and you're saying, well, I'm doing that because I want to preserve muscle, but I'm going to show I'm going to lose more weight, and I can get into the regulatory pathway by doing that. So this concept of incremental weight loss being an endpoint is not quite right. The endpoint is I'll give you an example. If you have a new drug and you hit 5% weight loss in a year, you're in, okay? If you have a drug that already exists at 10%, 15%, and you add another drug like an amylin or something like that, and you get to 20%, what did you do for the patient? What's the difference between 15% weight loss, HbA1c, insulin resistance, lipids get better, something else, okay? Or in the case of our drug, we can show that we have a benefit in function. Okay, we have a benefit in function, but we just showed a detriment in function in older patients, and we made it better. I imagine GLP-1 containing drugs are gonna make HbA1c, insulin resistance, and lipids better. So if you add more weight loss, you make better. I mean, that's going to be hard to show versus making something worse better. If that makes sense with physical function. So I think you're going to see people are going to scratch their heads because they're going to try to figure out how the combinations are going to be able to be approved and not approved separately. And so myostatin inhibitors kind of fall in that bucket. I think that you'll see that they do a good job with lean mass, but the FDA will not accept a cosmetic lean mass as an endpoint. You have to show function, and we demonstrated in our phase 2B function. So if we did a phase 3 that looks just like a phase 2B, boy, have we de-risked the program.
Right. I think what you said about what the endpoint that the FDA is going to be looking for, whether it's a functional endpoint, whether it's a body composition endpoint, it's going to be very important, right? You showed the functional endpoint that you could meet that, whereas the other molecules, myostatin inhibitors, we know that they build muscle, and they've shown that they build increase in lean mass. But they haven't shown the functional data, which is going to be very important if that's what the FDA wants, right?
FDA is going to want something that tissue does other than body composition change on a scan.
Right. I think safety is another important topic for investors, since you could push the weight loss with combining or making it more potent with the GLP-1s, but it also comes with a host of GI tolerability issues. What can you say about the safety in the trial now? I know it's still blinded for the extension portion, but the drug molecule itself, prior safety?
Yeah, so the answer is we're very fortunate that we've had 27 clinical trials that have been done. We have a database of 1,600 patients, and we've done doses of 9 milligrams and 18 milligrams and much higher than a 6. Some patients have taken it for over 3 years, and it's been incredibly well tolerated. So we have a significant database. We also see the data, although it's blinded, we see in aggregate. So we may not know what patients on what dose, but we can tell you that the aggregate data doesn't look much different than what we've seen with the Enobosarm or, quite frankly, GLP-1 by itself. So no signals there. Then the third thing is we have what's called an independent data monitoring committee that meets, and they review the unblinded data, individual data, and so this way you can protect patients. And they met last week. When they met last week, they came back to fine, continue this plan. So our plan is in the second quarter when we unblind the study to present the safety data, and then it'll be clear. But we have evidence now, database, safety database, and IDMC and aggregate data. that we've said publicly that, you know, we're not seeing anything surprising.
And we'll see that extension data when, mid-year?
Yeah, so second quarter, we expect to see the maintenance data and what happens when you stop a GLP-1. And I'm excited about that. And then because the study will be unblinded at that point, we'll have safety data for the full time of the trial. So it'll be for the GLP-1 combination part and the extension part.
Yeah, we'll keep an eye on that also.
Yeah.
We're running close to the end of our time. As a final question from me, what is the partnering plan or strategy if you're thinking about one, financing to move the compound into phase 3 studies?
Yeah. So the excitement is we had such a positive phase 2 that you know, people know we have to do a phase 3 now. And so we have a little bit of a financial overhang because people are saying, oh, they did it, and now they're gonna have to do a phase 3. Well, be careful in the sense that yes, we're gonna do phase 3. We're gonna meet with the FDA as soon as we can after the study's unblinded, so we have all our data to understand exactly what the phase 3 program is gonna look like. But I can tell you that, you know, we're not considered a weight reduction drug, we're a body composition drug. And when you do that and look at the guidance that just came out, that's not, the guidance says if you're a body composition drug, it's outside the scope of the weight reduction guidance. Why is that important? But weight reduction drugs require big studies, 4,500 patients, 1,500 placebo, 3,000 treated patients. But we're not doing that. We're going to do physical function as a primary endpoint. We're looking at body composition. We're looking at the combination. So we believe that the trial will be based on a sample size calculations as opposed to an ICH guidelines as opposed to weight reduction guidance. And so if that's the case, and you're looking at a 2-arm study that we a total of about 400 patients plus, and that's about $40 million over 18 months. That sounds a lot better than 4,500 patients. And with that said, yes, we're actively talking to potential partners. We had several that we've talked to prior to the study. They're very interested in what we're doing. They want to see data. Everybody wants to see data. So now we've got the first tranche of data. Then we'll have the unblinded data. Then we'll have the maintenance data. Then we'll have FDA clarity. So we have a few milestones to get through to continually increase the value of the asset. And so, yeah, partnering would be our main objective. But we also have to be able to show that we can do it on our own, because that's how you get the best partnership. And I think by having a trial size that's doable and the amount of money that can be raised to a company our size, that puts us in a position to sit tight and make sure we get the best deal. And then furthermore, we do have, as last reported in our earnings call, we have about $27 million in cash as of our last reporting. And that will last us till the end of the year. So we're good. We can sit tight until we get, you know, clarity on our development program.
Yeah, I would think that the large pharma who are working on next generation GLP-1s, the oral ones, will be knocking on your door looking for some sort of partnership.
That's a great point, because think about that for a moment. We could be used with any GLP-1. Okay, the best, and so in that situation, you have a company that says, I'm going to supply to any GLP-1 containing drug. But if a GLP-1 leader wants to take the market, particularly have an oral compound, then you can do a fixed oral with the Enobosarm oral and the GLP oral, and then nobody can get access to the drug unless you buy that drug. So it could be very interesting.
Exactly. Well, thank you for joining us today, Mitch, and giving us your time. I'm going to hand it over back to Tim.
Great. Thanks, Del. Thank you for joining us today and for your, and I mean this genuinely, truly, uniquely insightful, granular comment on GLP-1s. Mitchell Steiner, President and CEO of Veru, NASDAQ, ticker symbol VERU. Also, thanks to my equity research colleague and creator of the WTR Biotech Spotlight podcast series, Do Kim.
Always a pleasure, Tim.
And then finally, a special thanks to the producer and editor of the podcast, my WTR colleague, Joe Brunetto. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, as well as listening to www.watertowerresearch.com to stay up to speed on the company's small cap written research reports, podcasts, fireside chats, and conference schedules. We will see you in 2 weeks for the next edition of the WTR Biotech Spotlight podcast.